In the far south of the African continent, where two oceans collide, there is a land shaped by beauty and scarred by memory. A land where gold lies beneath the soil, diamonds glitter in the dark, and history presses down like a weight that never fully lifts. This is a place where the earth itself promised wealth, but the people paid the price before the world gave it a name, before borders were drawn in ink and blood. This land already knew conflict. Not just battles of armies, but battles of identity. Of who belongs, of who decides, of who benefits, and who is erased. Power did not arrive quietly here. It came with ships, with laws, with guns disguised as order, and once power took root, it learned how to stay. For centuries, the question was never whether South Africa would be rich. The question was who would own that richness, who would walk freely across the land, who would be told where to stand, who would speak and who would be silenced. The answers were written not only in government buildings, but in the daily rituals of life, in where people lived, in which doors they were allowed to open, in which dreams were permitted and which were criminalized. This is not just a story about a country, it is a story about a system designed to measure human worth, to rank it, to enforce it. A system that claimed legality as morality, that wrapped domination in paperwork, that turned separation into policy. And once separation becomes law, injustice becomes routine. For decades, the world watched. Some protested, some benefited, many looked away. Because South Africa was not an anomaly, it was a mirror, a reflection of a global struggle between ideals written on paper and realities enforced on the ground. Freedom versus control, equality versus hierarchy, democracy versus exclusion, conflicts that echoed far beyond Africa's southern tip, reaching across the Atlantic, into the streets, courts, and classrooms of the United States itself. Different histories, different languages, but hauntingly familiar questions. Who gets to vote? Who gets to own land? Whose lives are protected by law and whose are policed by it? In South Africa, these questions did not fade with time. They intensified. The pressure built quietly, relentlessly, until the nation itself seemed to hold its breath. Because when injustice is sustained long enough, it does one of two things: it breaks people, or it teaches them how to resist. And resistance here did not always look like victory. It looked like sacrifice, like prison cells, like funerals, like names whispered in fear and later spoken with reverence. It looked like generations growing up knowing exactly what the system expected of them and choosing to defy it anyway. The cost was enormous, the consequences irreversible, and yet, the story does not end in darkness. Because South Africa is also a story of endurance, of a nation forced to confront itself, to ask whether reconciliation is possible without forgetting, whether justice can exist without revenge, whether a future can be built on a past that refuses to stay buried. Today, the world sees a different South Africa, a democracy born from negotiation, not conquest, a constitution admired globally, a country still wrestling with inequality, still haunted by old lines but no longer defined by law-enforced separation. The scars remain, so do the questions. Has power truly shifted or only changed hands? Has freedom delivered equality or only the promise of it? And how does a nation move forward when its past is not past at all? To understand South Africa now, we must first face what it was then. Not as a timeline of dates, not as a list of leaders, but as a human story of control and resistance, division and defiance, injustice and the long, unfinished pursuit of dignity. This is the story of South Africa, not just how it fell apart, but how it tried against all odds to put itself back together. Long before the country of South Africa had a name, this land held one of the deepest human stories on earth. For thousands of years, the same people lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the rhythm of the seasons. Their lives were guided by an intimate knowledge of animals, plants, and the climate. Survival depended on cooperation, not conquest. Decisions were made together, and authority was shared. They were also the Khoi, pastoral communities who raised cattle and sheep, migrating across vast grazing lands. For them, wealth wasn't measured in land ownership, but in livestock and the strength of their social bonds. Over many centuries, Bantu-speaking societies migrated south, bringing with them new ways of life. They introduced agriculture, the skill of iron working, and more organized political systems. Small villages grew into powerful chiefdoms, and complex trade networks connected communities across great distances. Of course, conflict existed here, just as it did everywhere else in the world. But a person's identity was not defined by the color of their skin. Power was local, it was negotiated, and it was always shifting. The idea that your race could determine your destiny simply had not yet arrived. Then, in 1652, everything began to change. Ships from the Dutch East India Company landed at the Cape of Good Hope. Their mission seemed practical: set up a resupply station for ships on the long journey to Asia. But a supply station needs land, and land requires control. Slowly at first, then more aggressively, farms expanded outward from the coast. Indigenous grazing lands were seized. Livestock was taken, either by force or through deeply unequal trades. When the local people resisted, they were met with military force. To work these new farms, enslaved people were brought in from East Africa and Southeast Asia. Labor, once a part of community life, became coerced and brutal. A new, hierarchical society started to take shape, built on a worldview brought by the European settlers, one shaped by empire, a specific interpretation of Christianity, and strict laws of private property. Gradually, race became directly linked to power and authority. This didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. In the early 19th century, control of the Cape passed from the Dutch to the massive British Empire. Slavery was officially abolished, but this did not lead to freedom for African people. The chains were simply replaced with new forms of control, forced labor systems enforced by contracts, backed by the threat of violence and the power of colonial law. As European settlers pushed further inland, wars erupted with established African kingdoms. These were not small skirmishes, they were prolonged, brutal conflicts against groups like the Xhosa and the powerful Zulu state. With each conflict, land ownership shifted decisively into the hands of the settlers. African political systems, which had governed for centuries, were systematically weakened or completely destroyed. New taxes were imposed, forcing African men off their own land and into wage labor on farms and in towns. South Africa was transforming into a settler-controlled colony. Political rights existed, but they were reserved exclusively for Europeans. This pattern wasn't unique. It mirrored what had happened in other parts of the colonial world, including the early United States, where the right to participate in politics was once limited by race and property. The late 19th century brought a discovery that would change South Africa forever. First, diamonds were found at Kimberley. Then, even more incredibly, massive gold deposits were discovered in the Witwatersrand. Almost overnight, the region became one of the world's most valuable mineral economies. But mining this immense wealth required labor, vast, staggering amounts of it. To meet this demand, African men were recruited, and later compelled, into migrant labor systems. They were forced to live in tightly controlled compounds, their movements constantly monitored. Families were torn apart, with men separated from their wives and children for months, or even years, at a time. This system of cheap, controlled labor became the very foundation of the nation's new wealth. And to protect that system, racial control became even more rigid and brutal. Economic growth and racial oppression became two sides of the same coin, completely inseparable. In 1910, the Union of South Africa was formed. On the surface, it looked like a modern nation. It had elections, it had a parliament, it had courts. But this was a democracy for whites only. Just 3 years later, in 1913, the government passed the Natives' Land Act. This single law confined black South Africans, who were the overwhelming majority of the population, to just a tiny fraction of the country's land. Owning land outside these designated areas became illegal. Poverty was no longer just a circumstance, it was now structurally and legally enforced. Then, in 1948, this entire system of control was given a name: apartheid. It was a word that would come to symbolize one of the most oppressive regimes in modern history. Under apartheid, every person was classified by race at birth. This classification dictated every aspect of their life. The law determined where you could live, where you could work, where you could go to school, and even who you could love. The infamous pass laws required Black South Africans to carry identification papers at all times. Forgetting your pass, or being in the wrong area, could lead to immediate arrest, imprisonment, or forced relocation to a desolate, government-assigned area. Millions of people were forcibly removed from their homes, their communities bulldozed to make way for white-only suburbs. They were dumped into overcrowded townships, or so-called homelands, barren territories designed to strip them of any political or economic power. Apartheid wasn't just casual segregation born from habit. It was a meticulously designed blueprint for total racial domination. It shaped every moment of daily life. Education for Black South Africans was deliberately and severely limited under the Bantu Education Act, an act designed, in the words of its architect, to teach black children that their only place in society was as laborers. Healthcare was segregated and unequal. Housing in the townships was overcrowded and lacked basic services. The police were given nearly out authority, enforcing the system with routine brutality. The migrant labor system continued to fracture families as children grew up barely knowing their parents. Entire communities lived under a constant state of surveillance and fear. For many white citizens, life under apartheid appeared orderly, comfortable, and prosperous. It was a world of manicured lawns, thriving businesses, and exclusive social clubs. But this reality was built on the complete subjugation of the majority. Two separate worlds existed side by side, enforced by the full power of the state. While other countries like the United States were grappling with civil rights, voting access, and school integration, South Africa was doubling down, enforcing total racial separation across every single institution of national life. But even under such crushing oppression, opposition never disappeared. The African National Congress, or ANC, founded way back in 1912, had initially pursued peaceful change through petitions, legal challenges, and organized protests. For decades, these efforts were either ignored or violently suppressed. As the state's violence grew more extreme, the resistance was forced to evolve, and one figure, more than any other, came to represent both the defiance of the people and the disciplined struggle for freedom: Nelson Mandela. In 1964, after a series of protests and a shift towards armed resistance, Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life in prison for opposing the state. He would spend the next 27 years behind bars, much of it on the notorious Robben Island. There, he was forced to perform hard labor, was isolated from his family, and was denied the most basic human freedoms. The government's goal was to silence him, to make the world forget his name, but they failed. His imprisonment did the opposite. It amplified his voice and turned him into a global symbol of the fight against injustice. By the late 20th century, the apartheid regime was facing a crisis on all fronts. Resistance at home was growing larger, more organized, and more defiant, despite the brutal crackdowns. On the world stage, the pressure was becoming unbearable. International sanctions crippled the economy. Cultural and sports boycotts isolated the nation, making it a global pariah. Diplomatic pressure from even its allies intensified. The system was becoming economically unsustainable and politically unstable. The cost of maintaining apartheid was simply too high. Finally, the regime began to buckle. Secret negotiations began between the government and the imprisoned leaders of the ANC. Then, on February 11, 1990, a moment the world had been waiting for arrived. Nelson Mandela walked free from prison. In the months and years that followed, The legal pillars of apartheid were dismantled, one by one. By the early 1990s, the system that had defined South Africa for nearly half a century was officially over, paving the way for the nation's first ever democratic election for all its citizens. Thank you for watching. If you found this history informative, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that shape our world. South Africa today is a constitutional democracy built on universal adult suffrage. Every citizen, regardless of race, has the legal right to vote, form political parties, protest, and challenge the state in court. National elections are held regularly and monitored by independent institutions, with outcomes widely recognized as legitimate. The African National Congress has governed since 1994, but its dominance has weakened. Opposition parties control major metropolitan governments, including Cape Town and Pretoria, reflecting a competitive if imperfect political environment. Unlike many post-liberation states, South Africa has not reverted to military rule or one-party authoritarianism. Power transfers remain civilian and legal. In this sense, South Africa's democratic continuity resembles the United States. Elections are contested, institutions are stressed, but the system itself has not collapsed. Yet voter turnout has declined steadily, particularly among younger citizens, an indicator not of repression, but of political disillusionment. Democracy exists. Confidence in it is uneven. South Africa's constitution is internationally regarded as one of the most progressive legal documents in the world. It explicitly protects freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, gender equality, religious liberty, and the independence of the judiciary. Socioeconomic rights such as access to housing, healthcare, and education are also constitutionally recognized. Courts have repeatedly ruled against the executive branch, including sitting presidents, demonstrating real judicial authority. However, governance has struggled to match constitutional ideals. State capacity has weakened in critical areas such as public utilities, policing, and local administration. Corruption scandals, especially those linked to state capture, have eroded trust and drained public resources. This tension mirrors challenges seen in the United States. Strong constitutional frameworks constrained by political polarization, bureaucratic inefficiency, and declining public faith. The law is powerful. The state's ability to deliver consistently is not. South Africa remains the most industrialized economy on the African continent. It is a major exporter of minerals, including platinum, gold, coal, and manganese. It also manufactures automobiles, machinery, and chemical products, many of which are exported to Europe, Asia, and the United States. As a member of BRICS, South Africa positions itself as a bridge between advanced economies and the global South. Yet economic growth has been slow. Unemployment is structurally high, especially among youth, and income inequality ranks among the highest in the world. Wealth remains concentrated, with capital ownership still largely disconnected from the country's demographic majority. This pattern parallels the United States, where economic expansion has not eliminated inequality and where labor participation lags behind productivity gains. South Africa's economy is functional, globally integrated, and resilient, but deeply unequal. Modern South Africa is highly urbanized. Johannesburg functions as a continental financial hub. Cape Town anchors tourism, technology, and creative industries. Durban remains a critical port city, connecting Africa to global shipping routes. Infrastructure reflects this complexity. World-class airports, highways, and banking systems coexist with aging power grids, water shortages, and informal housing settlements. Electricity supply instability, known locally as load shedding, has become a defining challenge, affecting businesses, hospitals, and households. Urban inequality in South Africa mirrors that of major U.S. cities, where economic opportunity and deprivation exist within the same metropolitan boundaries, separated less by law than by income and access. The cities work. They do not work equally. South Africa's population is young, connected, and digitally engaged. Smartphone usage is widespread. Social media platforms are central to political debate, activism, and cultural expression. Tech startups operate in fintech, renewable energy, and e-commerce, often linked to global investment networks. Culturally, South Africa has significant global influence, particularly in music, film, fashion, and sports. Youth identity today is less defined by race than by class, opportunity, and digital access. This generational shift resembles trends in the United States, where younger populations challenge historical narratives while navigating economic precarity. However, technological access is uneven. Connectivity does not guarantee mobility. Innovation exists alongside frustration. Legal equality has not translated into material equality. Land ownership remains concentrated. Educational outcomes differ dramatically between private, urban public, and rural schools. Crime rates remain high, driven largely by economic marginalization rather than ideology. Public healthcare struggles under demand, while private healthcare rivals international standards. These contradictions are not unique to South Africa. They reflect a global pattern where political rights advance faster than economic justice, a reality shared by many democracies, including the United States. South Africa's central challenge is not freedom, it is distribution. The gap between constitutional promise and lived reality defines the present era. South Africa today is neither a miracle nor a failure. It is a country that dismantled one of the most rigid systems of legal inequality ever created without descending into civil war or authoritarian rule. That achievement is real, but history did not end with democracy. Economic structures proved harder to transform than political ones. Inequality adapted instead of disappearing. Power shifted but did not dissolve. Like the United States, South Africa demonstrates a global truth. Removing unjust laws is only the beginning. Building equal outcomes takes generations and sustained political will. South Africa's story is not about redemption. It is about responsibility. A nation still negotiating the distance between what it guarantees on paper and what it delivers in daily life. The outcome is unresolved, and that uncertainty, more than any triumph or tragedy, is the real legacy of South Africa then and now.